let's not waste any time because we have got a lot to talk about. Despite what most people believe, there is actually a lot to talk about in Jailbreak of 2020. Like, even when I was discussing this with friends, they all said that, what are you even gonna talk about in this video? Because on the surface, there wasn't really a lot that happened, but what did happen was huge for the game's future. So I guess there's no better place to start at than where we left off in 2019. In 2019, we left off on a pretty optimistic note after the cargo plane update came out, which completely rejuvenated everyone's enthusiasm for the game. Just partially. See, there's a caveat with this, because the cargo plane update when it first came out wasn't really that functional, to be honest. Like, if you look at Dennis's video when it came out, he clearly was not having a fun time with the update. And even with my experience, I had a lot of issues with the cargo plane myself because there was issues with when it rained, your player character would not accurately stick to the cargo plane, so you would easily fall off. And it would just spawn in and not go to the airport at all, so you couldn't even rob it. It was very much apparent that this update was kind of rushed, but to be fair, the game was on life support during this time, so they just kind of had to get this update out as soon as possible to revive the game at whatever cost. So the cargo plane update was the update to get Jailbreak out of its very sorry state, but there was clearly still a lot of work to be had when it comes to actually reviving everyone's trust in Badimo at this time. And so to continue this momentum, they actually decided to release an update in January, which they do not normally do. We've only had like a few January updates because the scale of the winter updates really takes a toll on Badimo, so they really need a break after that. But it does seem like Badimo was on a mission to revive everyone's enthusiasm for Jailbreak. And what was their first edition? Grass. Hell yeah. I'm kidding, of course, but the first actual addition that they made to the game was, this thing. I'm not even gonna name it because I fucking hate but, yeah, this sucks, not because of the vehicle itself, it's actually kind of useful, but, yeah, maybe don't add things that relate to that fucking parasite. And the only other feature that was added in this update was road spikes, which is actually one of the first additions that cops received in a long while. And I can fully commend Badimo for this because cops have needed at least something for a while now. To be fair, it's not much, but essentially how it works is that a cop would place down a spike trap on the road, and they would wait for a criminal to run over it to pop their tires, which is very, very useful for cops. And considering how dry cop updates were in 2019, and frankly how completely fucking awful the cop team was back then, this was a very welcome addition to the arsenal for the cop team. I mean, if you think about it, a good chunk of the updates that cops got in 2019 just also applied to the criminal team, so really, the only thing they got was the military base, which is honestly not really that good in my opinion. So, yeah, this sets a really good precedent for the updates going forward in 2020. And so, in the next month of February, we would get a relatively similarly sized update. The most notable addition in this update was the jet ski racing game mode, and in my last video, I gave the other game modes a lot of shit. Like, Battle Royale just doesn't belong in the game, and I didn't even mention Alien Infection in my actual video. I had to include it in the description because it was so awful and forgettable. But this, I'm actually pretty fine with. With how vehicle-centric the game has become at this point, it's honestly a no-brainer to add a racing game mode, you know? But you would think that they would use the car chassis, right? Because that's where I think a lot of the appeal from Jailbreak comes from, is how accessible and smooth the driving cars are, but they decided to use jet skis for that. But honestly, I think they chose jet skis just because of how unreliable the car chassis is for racing, because, I mean, have you seen Jailbreak Motorsport? That shit is terrible. I've done some races in that, and it's honestly really not that fun. And because the area of water is much more open, I think it's just more reliable to use jet skis overall. So yeah, I think jet ski racing is a very welcome addition to the roster of game modes, because it's really the only one that, one, belongs in the game, and two, is good. And I guess the only other things in this update were the corridor bank vault, which isn't really that much to write home about. It's just another bank vault, very linear, very straightforward, and the new look for the game's lighting. And I think this is the origin point for my issue with the game's lighting, because across like nearly every single update, the game's lighting has been so goddamn inconsistent, it makes my head hurt. Like, if you compared the lighting from 2017 to early 2019, it's fairly the same. You can believe that it is still very much the same place. But once you get to the Jailbreak HD update and forward, that's when things start to get fucky. Because you got the orange sky that the game was always synonymous with, and then you got Jailbreak HD, which has its very pretty accurate shadows, but then it completely destroys the original aesthetic of Jailbreak by oversaturating everything. And then you got January 2020, which completely changes the daytime lighting for absolutely no reason, which I assume it's because it's a carryover from the 2019 cargo plane update. Because it was a winter map, it was very blue, so the lighting would be very blue, but they just did not bother to change that when the map decided to go green. And then you got February, which completely changes the lighting again, this time for daytime and nighttime. This probably seems like a very nitpicky non-issue for a lot of people, but I think this stuff matters. I think it's important that the integrity of the game's aesthetic remains consistent so that the game has a visual identity. Because when you go over to Jailbreak's main competition, Mad City, that game has a very saturated and frankly ugly art style, and I would hate for Jailbreak to, for some reason, adopt that. Because you got a lot of people saying during this time that, oh, Jailbreak and Mad City are completely different. Just compare one screenshot of one game to the other, and they look completely different. Which is a complete fucking lie, but during this time, Jailbreak was for some reason looking more like Mad City than Jailbreak, you know, the game with the orange sky and very Mexico-looking visuals. It may not seem like a big issue, but I feel like it's important to retain that familiarity and public retention. Yeah, you know how I said that on the surface there may not seem like a lot to talk about? Yeah, you really start to get my point now. If you've been watching my Jailbreak retrospective series, like, at least for a little bit now, you would know that I'm going to go into way further detail than probably anyone should. And I cannot believe that I'm 8 minutes into the video and I'm just now getting done with the second update of this year. Anyway, enough yapping. Here is where the first really big update for the game comes in. First off, this is the first update to retire any vehicles from being purchasable. The vehicles being retired in this update were the Steed, the Mighty, and the Brûlée. Oh yeah, might as well mention this now, but I'm only going to be referring to the vehicles by their in-game names, so I'm not going to be using the names of the cars that they're based off of. So what exactly was the purpose of retiring these vehicles? Well, it was to bring forth the new generation of vehicle models. The main art style of Jailbreak's vehicles were very low poly, not much detail, and no vehicle interiors to speak of. Until now, because the Eclair would be the first vehicle to have a full-fledged vehicle interior. It was all customizable, and it was all great looking, and it honestly fit this kind of aesthetic for Jailbreak than any other vehicle that was in the game at this point. And Asimo said that there was going to be a big push for all of the current vehicles to have full-fledged vehicle interiors, which I don't really know how to feel about, because now the game's look has become even more inconsistent. And of course, redoing the models for every obtainable vehicle in the game is going to take a ton of work. And still, to this day, as of recording this on October of 2024, we still have not been fully converted to this new art style. There are still vehicles in the game that are obtainable that still look so old. And I'm not even entirely sure if this push for vehicle interiors and higher detail vehicles was a bad decision, because of course you need to progress, because if the game still had these very low detail, low poly vehicles, it honestly would not age that well. But inconsistency is still a prevalent issue. So when making this decision, they had two choices of making the game consistently bleh or inconsistently honestly fucking ugly. And me personally, I would just rather have these things consistently bleh, because at least then you can extrapolate some kind of little low poly, very old gamey aesthetic with it. I don't know, maybe that's not such a good decision because it could lead to the Chibi Robo Ziplash effect where everything is low poly and it'll just be misconstrued for being fucking lazy. Yeah, at this point I think I made my point clear. This is not very much of a pretty looking game. And with that notion, it kind of makes me laugh when people drive certain vehicles because, oh, the model looks pretty. Bro, the game doesn't look pretty at all. What are you on about? And this also kind of relates to my issues with vehicle retirement, because now that you've retired those vehicles, you cannot go back and redo those models because people will be mad that you changed those vehicles because they're retired and there's no reason for you to change how they look. And this also goes for vehicles that were in previous seasons. You cannot go back and change their models. So even if every obtainable vehicle were to have this very high detail art direction, those retired vehicles are still gonna be in that old art style, and you cannot go back and change them. And you can even feel this effect when playing the game in present day, because you see people driving the Torpedo around because that is a vehicle in the meta and is very popular. You can notice that that vehicle does not fit with the current aesthetic at all. And it just makes the entire game so inconsistent and ugly, and it just hurts my head, man. They should have never done this. This was a mistake. Vehicle retirements really should have just never been a thing. It never should have happened, and there's even more reasons as to why I think that than, oh, the game looks even more ugly. And I will talk about those issues in another video, trust me. Speaking of things that look ugly, the new weapon models that got added in this update, which look fucking awful. These are terrible. I hate these. They just have this very hexagonal and polygonal look to them, which works for vehicles, but they just did it in the worst way possible for weapons. And the only reason I can think of for this is maybe the hexagonal look worked better with weapon skins, which were added in this update. Weapon skins are cool, don't have much to say about them, they are a welcome addition, they don't really do anything, but these new weapon models just do not look good at all, especially compared to how they looked before. They looked fine. I do not understand what was wrong with the previous weapon models, but they were fine for what they were. These, on the other hand, just look abhorrently ugly. And also, notice how the weapon models are now completely incongruent with how they look on the hotbar. Yeah, this point is very apparent. Badimo does not give a shit about how the game looks. However, with the addition of these absolutely horrendous weapon models, we have 3 new weapons to choose from. First off, the revolver, which deals 25 damage per bullet and has 6 bullets per round. Requiring very high accuracy, you can deal some crazy damage with this if you're good enough. If you have good enough aim, this is a very useful alternative to the base pistol. Second off, the sniper, a highly requested weapon to be added to the game for a while now. Like, I think at this point, I think it was a little late to add the sniper. But yeah, it's pretty simple. Just shoot players from a far distance and you can basically kill them in 2 shots. As a very evasive player, this is a very useful weapon for me. It was very strange how you had to obtain the revolver and the sniper though, because you had to go into robberies and manually obtain them, which it was cool that they were free, but I don't know why they couldn't just be placed within the gun shops. It was very Very weird. I didn't get it. And the third and final weapon for this update was the plasma pistol. And yeah, this was the shittiest weapon to be added in this update because it really only did a maximum of 60 damage on a full round, and you can only damage players from decently close range. So yeah, it was pretty not that great until you consider that it can shoot through force fields. What? Yeah, so the force field launcher was pretty overpowered for criminals, but now the plasma pistol is the perfect counter for that. Not only that, but it does spawn in the military base and for some reason costs money when the other weapons in this update do not. Very weird. But the fact that it does spawn in the military base and the fact that the military base is a spawn point for cops makes the plasma pistol a very useful weapon for cops. With additions like road spikes and now this, it seems like Badimo is actually starting to consider cop gameplay. But Badimo released an update a week after this one that had another weapon. This being the flintlock, which had 1 bullet per round and dealt 60 damage upon hitting someone. It's essentially what would happen if the sniper, the revolver, and the pistol had a love child. This is what comes of it. I've barely used the flintlock, so I wouldn't really be the one to know how good it is. But from what I've seen, it is pretty useful for people that have good aim because it's essentially a sniper that doesn't have the caveat of doing less damage in close range. So I'd say it's a welcome addition for people that find it useful. However, I will say that this new influx of weapons and items is kind of detrimental for how you access them. Because Jailbreak uses a very bare-bones hotbar and inventory system, it can be quite difficult to get to weapons that you need at specific moments. This is mainly an issue for PC players, but I see people cram every weapon in the game in their inventory, and I'm just left wondering, how the hell do you plan on using every weapon in your inventory? Like, if I need to deal damage to a player close range really fast, I would naturally want something like a revolver or a flintlock, but if my inventory is completely crammed with other shit and I need to reach my finger out to get a specific weapon, it just feels very unintuitive. Because this is a game where you do not want to be unprepared for any situation that could possibly happen. And this hotbar system does not help with that. In terms of a solution for this, I don't know, maybe take some inspiration from GTA 5 or at least something, I don't know. All I know is that this inventory system sucks balls. It just sucks that to this day, this issue still has not been addressed and is made worse by the fact that there is so much more stuff in the game now. You'll start to see later in the video how 2020 was the year to really revolutionize and advance Jailbreak's features. And you'll really start to see why I really don't think this decision was that good for the game in general, because having all this fluff in the game just kind of doesn't fit when it was originally created with a much smaller scope in mind. I'll get into these things much later, but I think this update was pretty good for what it was trying to go for, you know, really advancing weapons and, you know, the weapon variety and how these things worked. I think it was pretty well thought out. However, one more thought about this update is that I think it's kind of weird how fast these weapons were developed for the update. I can't really say for certain because I'm not Badimo and I don't work on the game in any capacity, so this is just going off of pure speculation, but I don't imagine that the first 3 weapons for this update, that being the sniper, the revolver, and the plasma pistol, were worked on any time before the first 2020 update came out. And especially because the flintlock was added a straight week after this update came out, it occurs to me that these weapons aren't really that hard to make, and the recent addition of the plasma shotgun kind of lends more credence to this theory because they didn't really make much of a big deal about this thing being added. So it kind of occurs to me that Badimo has the complete ability to add new weapons whenever they want. They just decide not to, which I think is a completely wasted opportunity to add even more weapon variety. I did say before that adding more weapons just kind of adds more fluff to the game, but Then again, you don't need to carry every weapon in the game at once, you can just carry the weapon that you like the most. For example, this is my own weapon loadout and organization. Notice how I don't really carry that many weapons. I don't carry a sword or a flintlock, I only carry weapons that I deem absolutely necessary. I just think it'd be fun if there were some subversions of weapons in the game to add more variety and gameplay depth. But yeah, I think I'm pretty much done talking about the March 2020 weapon and vehicle interior update. Pretty good, but it laid the groundwork for some very glaring problems. And it seems like the next update is going to be even bigger than the last one, as in the update thumbnail for March 2020, it said that the next update is going to be live. We are getting another live event. Let's see how this goes down. Later that month in March of 2020, we would get our first teaser for the 2020 live event, which didn't include much, but it did include this one shot of a character going towards some sort of button. Very strange, very ominous, leaves us questioning what is going on here. Later in this update's hype cycle, we would get a second teaser trailer and more imagery of this mysterious figure going for some button, and Asimo and Bad CC are trying to stop them. Who is this and what are they trying to do? I distinctly remember everyone thinking that it was going to be the Badimo guy that would be revealed to press that button. And even I subscribed to that theory too. I distinctly remember everyone thinking that it was going to be the Badimo guy that would be revealed to press that button. And even I subscribed to that theory too. For those who don't know, the Badimo guy was essentially the generic prisoner that would appear on the very old Jailbreak update thumbnails. And he's even the guy that appears in my own thumbnails of my Jailbreak analysis video series. And everyone thought that this was his way of getting revenge on Badimo for casting him out of the new recent Jailbreak thumbnails. Yeah, you can tell that the hype for this event was insane because everything about it was just bigger and better than the last live event. Another thing I personally remember was that lightning strikes were way more frequent in terms of damaging players. Like, because we were on lockdown during this time, I remember playing this game a metric shit ton back then. And I remember the lightning being so abundant and such a problem back then. It may seem unimportant and kind of annoying, but it is important to note before the event takes place. And one more thing to note was that a suspiciously silo-looking object was placed into the military base right before the live event. I wonder what that's for. And so on April 4th, 2020, the live event would start. Asimo and BatCC rushed to stop whoever this was from pushing this mysterious button, and before anyone could do anything, the button is pushed. And what comes of it? A fucking nuke! A feature that has been anticipated for a long time now. Asimo and BatCC quickly take off the person's disguise, and it turns out to be a random person from your server. Alright. So then the nuke explodes, and then a bunch of lightning comes around, and then rain starts to appear, and then there's a weather warning for a tornado that's gonna blow through the entire city, and then Asimo says that the more abundant lightning was because of the nuke, and then what the fuck is happening? And then the map just starts flooding out of nowhere because of the insane rain, and it's just a lot happening, and then it floods the screen, and then yeah, okay. What the hell is going on? So the flood pretty much destroys the entire map, and then we would have to reset our servers, and then once we join back, we would be welcomed to a brand new world. The map is now a peninsula surrounded by a giant ocean, and we have new boats to play with, and the city is completely revamped so it has some depth to the buildings. There's now a Golden Gate Bridge at the bottom of the map with a functioning drawbridge, and there's a bunch of other stuff placed around the map. It was just a ton of stuff happening and a ton of stuff added for this update. It was just a great time to be a Jailbreak fan in that moment, helped by the fact that there was a significant increase of people viewing the event. Like, there was an upwards of 500,000 people playing the game at this point. It may have even surpassed Adopt Me in terms of live player count, which is impressive because at this time Adopt Me was the untouchable game at this point. So props to Jailbreak for reclaiming its place on the popular page, at least for like a few minutes, I think. Now to actually analyze the content we've been given for this update. First of all, the new look for the city. I've already sung my thoughts about how I really did not like the direction they went with the new look for the city, because it went from being okay looking, it was a natural, very realistic art style, then that got completely destroyed later on. But this one, I actually really like how the city looks here, because we've essentially reeled back to how the city looked in 2017, because I've said before that I liked how you had to kind of use your imagination to fill in the gaps for what the city would actually look like, and we've kind of gone back to that here. I mean, hell, even some of the buildings are direct recreations of ones from classic Jailbreak. And another thing that I really did not like about the 2019 city was that it was just so colorful and bright and saturated, and it completely destroyed the initial creative idea that they were going with that city. But here, we've actually reeled that back, because if you look on the minimap, the city has actual, like, realistic, natural colors to it. It looks really good. There's also just other things that you would naturally expect to see within a city. First of all, there's a construction site with a crane, and there's a whole parking space right here, and there's a whole parking garage. It was just really well built. The only real downsides that I see with this city is that maybe this new art style might be a little too simple for what Jailbreak actually is. Like, if you actually take a look at the windows of the buildings, you notice that there really isn't that much detail and or variety. You could say the same thing about the 2017 city, but those buildings had actual variety in their window design. Hell, even the 2019 city had a bunch of variety in their window design on top of their detail. But this kind of aesthetic might seem a little too simplified for some people. It's sure of a hell of a lot better than what we had before, but at the same time we're sacrificing what could be. I think if you kept the three-dimensional detail of these buildings and mixed that with a more simplified, streamlined version of the window textures from 2019, I think you would have a very good aesthetic for how the city should look in Jailbreak. And the only other downside that I see to the city is that the amount of apartments got cut down tremendously. There's only now 3 apartments within the city, which I guess isn't really that much of an issue because apartments during this time were completely fucking useless, so yeah, not really that much of an issue, but still something to point out. The other big map change the game received in this update was the addition of the oceans, which I gotta say is probably one of the best map changes the game has received, period. Now, with this addition, the original aesthetic for the game is completely gone, because originally, the game's world was inspired by Sedona, Arizona, and now the game looks like San Francisco. Now, if you know me enough, you're probably going to assume that I'm not going to like this change because I much prefer that the game sticks to what it is rather than change for no reason. But in return, boats now have an actual practical use. So, do I care? Not really. And I think it also fixes the problem of the map feeling so small, because now you have all this surrounding landmass and it makes the map feel so much bigger. Yeah, so now that the amount of water in the map has increased exponentially, the amount of speed that you can kick up when you're driving a boat is absolutely insane. Just look at the jet ski here. Wow. And with the addition of the oceans, it only makes sense for more boats to be added to the game, which is what this update also did. First of all, the cruiser. This thing sucks. I'm just gonna be straight. This thing is god-awful, because at first, this thing costs around like $30,000, and for the price, you're not getting anything. Your cash is much better spent on buying the jet ski, because for some reason, that goes infinitely faster than the cruiser could ever dream of going. It may not have a passenger seat, but get real, who are you driving with anyway? And the second water vehicle that was added in this update was the sloop. Yeah, I know, a giant pirate ship. You can find this within the newly added pirate cave. And when you go to buy it, you will notice that it costs $1 million. Excuse me? If you're wondering, no, it does not go that fast. No, it doesn't have any weapons. you are buying this because it is a pirate ship. Asimo, bad CC, this is probably the worst vehicle in the game by far. The fact that this joke of a vehicle is at the same price as a Volt bike, a monster truck, hell, even the jet, is an embarrassment. What were they thinking with this? The most appropriate price that I can give this thing is like $100,000 because literally what does this thing do? Huh? What's that? I'm really curious as to what this thing actually does, worth its price. Crickets. I'm hearing nothing but crickets because genuinely, what does this vehicle do? I distinctly remember suggesting to Asimo that they should at least add cannonballs to this loop, at least something to make it at least useful. Maybe you could guard yourself from cops that way. I don't know, just at least something. And I know there's some debate about how every vehicle doesn't need to be the most practical, but I don't think any vehicle should be as much of a joke as the sloop. I don't see any value in this thing. I think it would just make a lot of people happy if this thing were to just have a price drop or just be removed from the game altogether. Yeah, the vehicles in this update were awful, and there's no doubt about that. Yeah, overall, there was a lot of good and bad about this update, but I would say that it's mostly positive. I mean, it was really the first actual live event that Jailbreak actually pulled off, because the one before this was kind of bad. But this one had so much stuff going on, and there were actual ramifications for what took place. It was really cool to see. But talking about the actual live event for a second, I want to mention something that kind of diminishes my appreciation for the live event just a little bit. Because you know in my 2019 video how I said that Badimo just loves ripping off Fortnite all the time? This is another example of that. Because I want you to compare and contrast this live event to the end event that Fortnite did in October of 2019, which was mere months before this one, because both of them have very apocalyptic, end-of-the-world scenarios, everything is going to shit, and then afterwards there's some downtime with something that covers your screen, and then once everything is back, you have an update very focused on water, because Fortnite Chapter 2 added the swimming mechanic and added fishing, and this one added the oceans. There's a lot of similarities that I'm noticing. Yeah, there's no doubt in my mind that Badimo looked at the Fortnite end event for inspiration, because admittedly it was like the biggest thing that happened during that time, and because of the similarities that I just listed. And I know there's gonna be people that are gonna be like, oh, taking inspiration isn't bad, this is completely okay. But it's just so clear to me that Badimo is just trying to ape off of Fortnite's success, which that might be part of the reason why this whole event was so successful. I mean, can you really count how many live events happened after Jailbreak's first? I mean, it makes sense to me that a lot of Roblox players were itching for any kind of live event content after Fortnite had their big one not even a few months ago. So I think it's safe to say that Badimo has a lot of thanks to give to Epic Games for having their live event be so successful. One more thing I wanted to point out about the event itself is the music, which was composed by Lon Reality and is the composer for a lot of the music you hear in Badimo related projects. They composed the music for Asimo's showcase game Buena Vista, they composed the music for Volt, and composed a lot of the music for the future robberies in Jailbreak. I mention this because Lon Reality is actually a very underrated composer, because I actually got really emotional at the tail end of the 2020 live event because of the music that was playing. They are an absolutely fantastic composer, major props to them, and I highly recommend their work. So yeah, that was the 2020 live event, probably one of the most important updates in Jailbreak history, because it pretty much set course for what we know today as modern Jailbreak. Whether that's a good thing or a bad thing is debatable, but this update was very hit or miss, but still it is very important, and it's honestly a very good update in my opinion. Props to Badimo for this. Anyways, we should be moving on because we are 30 minutes into the video and we haven't even gone halfway through this year of content. And the next update being the Nuke update. Yeah, remember that nuke that went off in the live event? That was actually a teaser for a new feature that would come in this update. Like I said before, this was strangely a highly requested feature for a long time. Not because of the community actually wanting it, but because of a joke that Badimo made on the old Trello page they had. A bit of a jailbreak history lesson, but Badimo used to actually have a fully dedicated jailbreak Trello page. And what Trello was basically a project management tool for a team to basically organize their ideas. And this was a way to organize ideas that the community sends them. It doesn't exist anymore to my knowledge, but this is actually where a lot of big features were first conceived. Of course you have nukes, but then you also have things like security cameras, being able to choose your spawn location, spike traps, trading, skydiving, radio playlists, improved weapons, improved apartments, planes, miniguns. All these things are conceived so early in Jailbreak's lifespan that it's honestly crazy. Like, if I'm not mistaken, this whole Trello page has existed since Jailbreak was conceived. So it's kind of fascinating how things like trading were conceived so early on and only got added so late. It makes you wonder what trading would look like if it got added in like 2018. Anyway, getting off topic, this was their idea for adding nukes into the game. Essentially, it would be an overpowered game pass with an outrageous price, and you would literally nuke the server. Every criminal that would die would become a prisoner, and all the robbery timers would be reset. It would just be a clusterfuck that you would cause. And upon detonating the nuke, you would receive an exclusive, explosive chat tag next to your name. And overall, what we got is pretty similar to that description. Essentially, how it worked in-game was that you would need to obtain uranium to launch the nuke, whether that be through earning it through leveling, or just straight up buying it with 20,000 Robux. Upon launching the nuke, it would explode and create a giant explosion that would kill nearly everyone on the map. The only way to survive it is if you go on the absolute outskirts of the map, but most likely you're probably gonna die. But upon getting hit by the explosion, you are rewarded with a radiant yellow color for your vehicle. It doesn't really look that yellow, it just kind of looks like a really lime green, but other than that, it is a really neat reward for getting killed by a nuke. Sort of adjacent to the chat tag you would receive upon launching the nuke, but this time everyone gets the reward. It is kind of unfortunate that we didn't get to see what it would look like when Shedlesky whales float up to the surface and give everyone safes, but I'll take what I can get. Yeah, nukes are clearly just a funny little goof feature, and normally I'm opposed to Badimo adding very unnecessary shit to the game when they could be diverting their resources to actually good content. But this, I'm gonna have to give a pass because this is just simply too fucking absurd to pass up. This is just kind of the outlandish charm that Jailbreak has, and frankly, a lot of Roblox games have. I mean, it's really not any more absurd than what happened in the 2020 live event, because what happened was that a nuke got launched that fucked up the weather, and then a tornado came by and blew through the whole city, and then the rain got so bad that it flooded the entire landmass of Jailbreak. This is slapstick. This is slapstick humor. I mean, you also have the April Fool's updates and the multitude of Easter eggs on the map, and then there's rocket fuel could be considered one of those silly things. Jailbreak is a silly game. I don't think this is something that you should really take that seriously in terms of tone. And I know I rag on Jailbreak for like not being realistic, but that was an artistic decision that they really should have committed to. But overall, aesthetically and artistically, this is like a really silly game. It's all over the place, and I think it's got kind of a charm for it. One more thing about nukes is that it completely removed the season system, because it completely ended Season 4, and the only way to really obtain a nuke is by getting level 50 on either team. So I guess I gotta thank nukes for completely getting rid of the shitty season system that was there before. Now, nukes were not the only thing in this update. We also got the UI revamp. For the longest time, Jailbreak has had the exact same UI it has had since release. And now Badimo figures that it's time to completely redo the aesthetic of the UI. And I am really divided on this new UI revamp. One side of me is saying that the new UI meshes better with the new aesthetic for the city and kind of the new aesthetic for the whole game in general. But other parts of me are saying that the new UI doesn't really look that good, and that the old UI really didn't need fixing. Like, the only issue that the old UI had was that everything was not congruent in uniform, and this new UI went ahead and fixed that. The thing is, though, is that after this update, future UI elements would not stick to this new art style. Specifically, I'm talking about UI elements that have been updated or added recently. Things like the new garage UI, trading, safes, and crews. Those are all features where the UI is not cohesive with the rest of the game. It's just the same thing that happened with the 2018 live event, where they bring out this new art style but just decide not to commit to it for some reason. Whether or not the new UI actually looks good or not is really just up for debate, but the actual good things that came out of the UI revamp was the removal of missions and the starter pack. I said before in one of my last videos, but missions are a complete joke of a feature, so they just kind of deserve to be thrown out. And the starter pack also was completely useless. It only gave you a pickup truck and a peach texture for your vehicle at the low price of 400 Robux. Yeah, that is a complete scam. Not to mention that it was also advertised to be a discount from 1200 Robux, so yeah, a real teaser for Badimo's soon-to-be-seen malicious practices. The only other thing in this update that's really worth noting was the new maximum security prison. I did not talk about the maximum security prison in my last video because it really wasn't worth noting, but essentially when you get a high bounty and you get arrested, you get sent to the maximum security prison, which is assumed to be a much harder version of the base prison. Which is just not true. I mean, in the old max security prison, you just spawn at the military base, so it wasn't really that hard to escape because there aren't really that many cops spawning there. And when you're trying to escape the base prison, your number one enemy is going to be the police because cop activity is most prevalent in the prison most of the time. So when there's another prison where cops are less likely to be at, that makes things infinitely easier. And with this new maximum security prison, it makes things even worse because now it's even easier to escape because there's no cops. Yeah, this new prison is essentially just isolated from the rest of the map, and the platforming you have to do to escape is honestly easier than what you have to do in the base prison, so what the fuck was the point of this? The only thing that I consider a plus side is being forced to use the cruiser to actually escape the island, which I could not wish this upon my worst enemy even if I tried. Jokes aside, this sucks. And I guess the last thing for this update was they added this thing to the base prison. No further comment. Anyway, enough about nukes and stuff. It's time to talk about one of the two robberies that was added in 2020. The cargo ship. Once the oceans were added, it was kind of a no-brainer to add some sort of robbery that took place within the water, and a cargo ship was the perfect thing for that. And this is probably the only robbery in the game as of now that involves helicopters heavily. Because for this robbery, you would need some type of aerial vehicle that had a deployable rope. What you would do is approach the cargo ship as it's moving through the water and try to grab a cargo crate with your rope as the defensive missiles are shooting at you. Once you successfully grab your crate, fly away and drop it off at the cargo port. Do this process 2 times over and reward yourself with $5,000 to $7,000 in in-game cash. And I gotta be honest, it's The robbery's Now, I do appreciate how it actually does make use of helicopters other than transportation, but other than that, I really don't see anything much else going for it. My main gripe with the cargo ship is that the robbery happens so fast, to the point where you can't really appreciate the cargo ship that much. Other than robberies like the small stores or the trains, Every other robbery in the game makes it feel like a genuine heist, like you're actually doing something. Like, just look at the crown jewel or the jewelry store. Those are robberies that on average take like 1 to 2 minutes, and even the tomb takes like 3 minutes. But the cargo ship on average only takes like a few seconds to do. And yeah, if you get hit by the missiles a lot, you're gonna be hindered by those, but if you know what you're doing, that's not gonna happen. Like, for example, I see a lot of people using the military heli for the cargo ship, but honestly, that's the worst vehicle to use it for. You should always use aerial vehicles with small hitboxes like the Little Bird or the Escape Bot. That way, the cargo ship's missiles will most likely never be able to hit you. And once you've got that down, the cargo ship really isn't that much of a challenging robbery. Your only incentive to rob the cargo ship is pretty much just for the money, and I play Jailbreak to have fun, so there's really no reason for me to rob the cargo ship at all. And in terms of cop interactivity, there really isn't anything for them either. There really isn't any way to properly intercept criminals that are robbing the cargo ship. The only thing that you can really do is camp the cargo warehouse, but most of the time that's not really successful. The only other thing that cops can do is dump the cargo crates into the ocean, which yeah, does lend them a cash bonus, but you can only get a cash bonus from a certain amount of crates. This is literally the same thing that they did with the passenger train, except it's worse because you can't properly arrest criminals. I will say that it is significantly better than Mad City's cargo ship robbery, which was kind of just a mini bank that was placed right outside the city criminal base. However, I cannot say the same thing about Mad City Chapter 2's cargo ship robbery, because that is just way better than this. To me, this is just that one robbery that uses helicopters and is pretty much a way of getting free money without really doing much of anything. So, can I really complain about it? Well, yes, I can, because I want more than this. The best thing about this update is that it gave us the ability to pick up vehicles with helicopter ropes, which is very funny. Anyway, enough of that mid-robbery, we can move on to the next update, which is the first 5 days of vehicles. The 5 days of vehicles updates would become a mainstay for Jailbreak, becoming an annual tradition. Basically, it would be a week-long string of updates where for every day, a vehicle would either be revamped or added. And for every day, there would be a plethora of bug fixes, which would make the game infinitely more polished. However, I can't really say that I don't really look back on 2020's 5 days of vehicles that fondly, if at all, because it really only added 2 vehicles, and technically none if you really think about it. First off, let's just get the revamps out of the way. We got new models for the UFO, and the Stallion. To give these vehicles some credit, their new models do look really good because they've adopted the new look for Jailbreak vehicles that the Eclair had. And to be honest, they do look a bit better than the Eclair, mostly due to how smooth their models are. But aside from those vehicles, the 2 actually new vehicles are the Surus and the Challenger. Now, I want you to look at a few vehicles that actually got retired before these were added. Look at the SUV that was retired in this update, and the Steed, as I said before, was retired in the March update. Now I want you to look back at the Surus and Challenger. Look at the SUV and Steed. Look back at the Surus and Challenger. They are the same thing. These vehicles serve the exact same purpose respectively. The most distinct one obviously being the Surus, because it's essentially a La Matador with 2 extra seats. So if you're looking to buy a Lamborghini, but you also have a team of 4, and you've got $9,000 extra to do so, this is your go-to. And the SUV before this had 4 seats, so it was a really good team vehicle, so yeah, serves the same purpose. It is essentially just a better SUV. Now, the Challenger, on the other hand, is most blatantly a replacement for the Steed. They're both American muscle cars, and they have nearly identical stats, so I ask, what was the point of adding this? Like, I get the push for better vehicle models, but at the same time, you could have just given it a free upgrade like you did with the Model 3 and the Stallion. If you wanted a better Steed, you could have just made a better Steed. Why did you have to make a new whole vehicle for it? Not a huge issue, but still is something that I really do not get. Yeah, as you can tell, this is definitely the weakest 5 days of vehicles we've ever gotten. But that's not the only thing we got during this time, as a week later we would be surprised with a new power plant revamp. The entirety of the power plant building was rebuilt entirely, and now it looks much better, but to be honest, this is just unnecessary. The way you get in the power plant is pretty much unchanged, except for the fact that you can now go in from the front instead of the back. And now there is a bit more platforming inside of the power plant itself. You still have your conveyor belts, but now they are rigged with a bunch of pistons and death pits, so there's a lot more to worry about inside of the power plant. And all of this is completely unnecessary when you consider the fact that the inside of the power plant is not why you're robbing the power plant. I talked about this in my last video, but the power plant is genuinely one of the best designed robberies in the game, not because of what you do inside of the building, but because of the skill curve to get the most cash in the least amount of time. But this power plant revamp does nothing to help that aspect of the robbery at all, so I ask, what was the point of this? Sure, the build is cool, but now it takes longer to get in and out of the power plant, so in my opinion, this is a net negative. Not to mention that some of the platforming can be really annoying and inconsistent. This pillar right here is a good example because you would assume that you would need to crouch under it, but if you have a short enough avatar, you can just completely ignore it, which isn't how it should be designed. But even then, I've had numerous occasions where my avatar should be just short enough to go under the pillar, but no, I just get damaged anyways, which is stupid. Yeah, in my opinion, this quote-unquote revamp of the power plant should have never been implemented at all. And overall, I think this update was completely unnecessary. And if you're gonna say, oh, it brought 5 days of vehicles, which was like a tradition for Jailbreak, this 5 days of vehicles was not good. I'd only be saying that if this 5 days of vehicles was good. And yeah, so far 2020 has been a real mixed bag. You've had updates that have been really good for the game, but the last two are just really mid, if I'm gonna be real honest. But hopefully the update quality will start to pick up from here on out, and luckily for me, they do. Because in August of 2020, we would be introduced to the next $1 million vehicle, the Blade. If I'm not mistaken, this is the first $1 million vehicle that has been added to the game since, like, the Jet. And no, the Sloop does not count because fuck the Sloop. So because we were getting another $1 million vehicle that actually seemed to have some use to it, there was a lot of hype for it. And I gotta say, that hype was completely justified because when it came out, it was really, really good. It was essentially just a flying car because it worked very similarly to a helicopter, but you could only get so far off the ground to where it's not that overpowered. And because of that, it was one of the coolest vehicles to ever be added to Jailbreak, period. Like, if you're gonna go ahead and add a really cool futuristic vehicle, this is the way to do it rather than adding the Volt Bike, which is an atrocity to mankind. It's got great acceleration and top speed for an aerial vehicle, but it's not too hard to shoot down because you don't fly that high off the ground. And if you're going to compare it to the Volt Bike again, it also just has a larger hitbox than the Volt Bike, which is just overall better for the game. Like, honestly, reflecting back on this vehicle, I have nothing but praise for it because it's just one of the best $1 million vehicles that Badimo has ever added to Jailbreak. However, there were some really bad glitches that players abused when the Blade came out. First of all, an auto arrest glitch, which I do not remember at all. So if somebody could show me like a clip of that and how it worked, that would be greatly appreciated. And there was a no-clip glitch that players often use at the museum, but that got patched shortly after the Blade came out. I mention these things because they're fairly important to what I'm about to mention next. For those who don't know, the Blade's model is actually based off of the spinner from Blade Runner, specifically Blade Runner 2049. And I suppose Badimo was just a really big fan of the Blade Runner movies because this entire vehicle is a giant reference to Blade Runner. I mean, if it wasn't obvious enough, the name Blade is just taken from Blade Runner. And on the default license plate of the Blade, you can see a word that seems to make out the word replicant, which is a key plot point in the Blade Runner movies. I guess I can also note that the Blade Runner movies were, cyberpunk noir crime thrillers, so I guess it is very fitting for the spinner from those movies to be added into a very crime-centric game. But regarding all of this, why exactly am I mentioning all of these things? Well, as you all probably know, the Blade would just be completely removed from the game on October 6, 2020. And it's become very widely accepted across the community that the reason for the Blade being removed from the game is because of its relation to the Blade Runner movies. Now, I will say that it is very hard to determine whether this is the case or not because Badimo has been very silent about these things. The only real basis people have of believing this theory is just from how sudden the removal of the Blade was. And because the Blade is based off of a vehicle from a movie, it's natural to assume that Warner Bros. Just came knocking on Badimo's doorstep and was like, hey, we don't want our vehicle in your game because fuck you. Yeah, very unfortunate how this wonderful vehicle had to be cut from the game. But just a month after the Blade was removed, a new vehicle would be added to sort of bring back the Blade. And that, of course, would be the drone. And I gotta be honest, this thing is not really that worthy of being a successor to the Blade whatsoever. First of all, the things that don't really matter, I gotta be honest, the drone does not really look that good. Like, have you ever seen those concept pictures of the Fruitiger Aero flying cars that look really fucking ugly? That is what the drone is, except the drone looks even worse. Like, it's not even about how the drone itself looks, it's just the model. Like, you can really see where the model just completely breaks, like, especially in the propeller shields and the headlights. Like, normally, I do not give a fuck about how a vehicle looks. I'm more concerned about how the thing actually controls. But when the model is such a downgrade from what we had, it's hard not to criticize it. Because when you look at the Blade, it is genuinely a really good model. And then you look at the drone, and you're just like, why is it like this? Of course, people are gonna say, oh, they had to remove it, they had to replace it. But I don't think that should come at the cost of the model looking good. And beyond that, what actually matters is the performance of the drone itself, because it is actually worse than the Blade. Yeah, from what I remember, the Blade had like a top speed of 160, and the drone only has a top speed of like 140. Another decision where I'm like, why is it worse? I'm not really sure if it was because of like balancing or whatnot, but I honestly think the Blade was fine for what it is, because at least then it had a large enough hitbox for you to just shoot it down. Another thing I wanted to point out that might have been another positive for the Blade being removed and replaced was that it used a specific sound for its engine called a shepherd tone. And what a shepherd tone is a soundbite that has a note that seems to be constantly rising infinitely, even though it isn't. That seems nice, and it does give the Blade a really distinct and futuristic engine sound, but it does have the side effect of giving players a bit of nausea when hearing it. I personally have never had any issues with the shepherd tone when I'm using any vehicles that do have it, but that is something to point out. But yeah, the drone is essentially just a worse version of the Blade, and unfortunately that's just what I know the drone as. I know I skipped over a bunch of updates, and I will get to those, but I want to reel it back to August real quick and talk about the other features that were added in this update. First of all, radios have been significantly improved, so you now have multiple stations, and you can have a playlist of your own custom ID, so that's really cool. And helicopter spotlights have been added to slow down players on foot. Never really found myself using helicopter spotlights that much, but they are there for people that want to use them. But overall, very solid update, at least for the time that the Blade was actually in the game. But other than that, I really don't think this update has any negatives to it. Thank God we did not continue the streak of really mediocre updates. Now we can actually get to some really good stuff. If you watched my previous video talking about Jailbreak in 2019, you would know that one of my talking points in that video was about how shafted the police team got in terms of content. And the balance between cops and criminals was essentially non-existent. Most players during this time played on the criminal team because playing on cop fucking sucked. You could easily just escape cops by spawning a vehicle near them. Jetpacks were completely overpowered. Cops were not automatically equipped enough to deal with criminals substantially. And you do not earn enough money to warrant the hassle of dealing with criminals, especially in these times. And guess what? All of these major issues would be addressed in the new balance update. Oh my god, can you believe it? Can you believe that Badimo is actually making an update that addresses the abhorrent team balance? While it's not much, and sure as hell does not make the cop team at all worth playing, it does make it a little less shit, because this is more than what they've been doing for like years now, probably since the game even came out. I can't list every change in balance that they made to the game because frankly it's not at all archived on the internet that much, but the important ones are not being able to spawn your vehicle next to the opposing team. Jetpacks obviously got a nerf. Pistols got an accuracy buff because cops spawn with them, so that's good. There's a new paycheck system for police, so they earn a little bit more money. And vehicles can no longer enter robberies because that's stupid. Those were overall the most substantial changes that the game received during this time, and while I don't think this update makes the cop team good at all, it is substantially better than before, so I'm not really gonna complain. I mean, the only people that are really going to complain about this update are the people that just abuse the shit out of how OP the criminal team was. Which, that stuff does not really make the game all that interesting, now does it? The only thing I will say is that this update did not address the Volt Bike glitch, which was plaguing the game at the time. If you don't know what the Volt Bike glitch was, basically what you needed to do was jump right at the same time as you were getting on the Volt Bike, and that would allow you to steer the Volt Bike not with the A and D keys, but with your first-person camera. Now that in itself doesn't seem like that much of an issue, but when you consider the fact that this makes the Volt Bike no longer interact with terrain properly by staying stationary along the X-axis, you realize that this becomes a fucking monstrosity. Because essentially what this means is that the Volt Bike is always going to want to be stationary along the X-axis. So when it interacts with terrain, it's just going to fling itself upward, creating a mountain of issues. On top of the mountains, the Volt Bike is already scaling. Especially during this time in Jailbreak's lifespan, people were abusing the shit out of this glitch. As if the Volt Bike wasn't already the most overpowered, broken thing to ever be added to Jailbreak because it was a fucking mistake. But yeah, as you can see, there's still a lot of work to be done when it comes to team balancing, but I think we're on the right track. Only other things about this update is that it added the Ray, Deja, and Leah vehicles, but people do not use those anyways, so they're not worth talking about. Major props to Badimo for actually addressing the batshit insane balance the game had. Honestly, bravo to them. They deserve it. Alas, we are pretty much in the home stretch when it comes to covering updates in this year, so the next update we've got on our hands is the Town Revamp update. Now, I want to set the stage for this update, because before this update came out, there was a very viral tweet in the Jailbreak community about this custom-made Jailbreak vehicle that someone made. The person who modeled this vehicle was Rally Subi, a very infamous character nowadays, but back then, he was very known for his custom-made Jailbreak vehicle models that he made. And up until this point, he's been doing this for over a year now. He's been desperately trying to get some of his concepts into the game. Whether that should have been the goal for him or not, what's important is that the tweet did so well, it got Asimo's attention. And guess what? The vehicle would be added to the game not long after. But there is a catch, because the vehicle would only be purchasable for a week. Introducing the M12 Molten, Jailbreak's first limited time vehicle. And while the vehicle itself is alright for what it is, I gotta be completely honest, I don't think the Molten should have been added, at least in the way that it was. Because this is another thing that Badimo did that would cause a very bad domino effect to take place. Because before this, the only type of unobtainable vehicles were obviously retired and seasonal vehicles. But this is very deliberate in its design because it is very blatantly telling you that, hey, you can only get this vehicle within a 10-day period. And this completely introduced a FOMO effect to the game, the fear of missing out. Of course, Seasons had this too, but you had way more of a chance to get those vehicles than this. As much as I disagree with this decision, if it's a one-off thing, I'll let it slide. But this way of adding vehicles for a limited time would soon taint future updates. Because after this update, we would get the Agent, and then soon after that, we would get the Torero, and then a bit of time after that, we would get the Snake, and then the Parisian, etc, etc. And the thing about this is that this was a really effective way of getting players to join the game and grind the game out so they could get this new limited vehicle. But my gripe with this is that I think this is the origin point for Badimo's very artificial ways to get people to play the game. This way of introducing FOMO just to increase player count is so infectious. These limited vehicles and the season system kind of just reinforces this idea that you need some kind of motivation, some kind of reward to keep playing the game, when that is just so backwards. The reason this game was so successful in the first place was because it was just a fun, well-designed game. Not because it had some bullshit FOMO factor in it, it was just a good game. And seeing Badimo just keep on doing this limited vehicle thing over and over and over again, just to keep on bringing players back for a limited time, it's just sad, because if the game was just fun, I feel like people would just play it. But no, I guess this limited vehicle thing was just too successful and it stuck around for no fucking reason. Not only that, but because this vehicle was so highly requested, I feel like this also gave way to the fact that Jailbreak is kind of less developed by Badimo and more so developed by the Jailbreak community. And no, I'm not talking about actually, like, making the game. I'm talking about influencing the ideas that Badimo adds to the game. Things like planes, the cargo plane robbery, the casino, the oil rig, the mansion, trading, pets, etc. were all highly requested features in the community, and is most likely why they're in the game in the first place. And I'm not even talking about the constant push for even more limited vehicles to be added to the game. And I didn't even mention the DeLorean, which was a highly requested vehicle by this one Twitter account that was dedicated to constantly requesting for the DeLorean to be added to the game. My point being is that I feel like the Jailbreak community has way too much of a stranglehold on Badimo for what they add to the game. I mean, Asimo has even said himself that the reason they constantly add more and more cosmetics to the game is because people constantly ask them to add more cosmetics to the game. And in my opinion, this constant drive to appease the Jailbreak community is kind of detrimental to the game's health. And I think all of these issues that we see in the present day can be traced back to this update, because this was the update that was very highly requested for the game and introduced a very heavy FOMO effect, which is, bad. It sucks because this update on its own is really strong, but because of the influence that I see this update had on future Jailbreak updates, I really do not like it. I guess I can also talk about the revamp they did to the north side town, which is honestly a really good build by Asimo, but doesn't really do that much, but it is nice to see a visual overhaul. I will say though that I do particularly like how the old town was destroyed by a volcanic disaster, sort of mimicking how the city was destroyed by the tornado in the live event and was rebuilt quickly after. And I guess this is also sort of a callback to the 2018 live event when the volcano erupted and we got a new city because of that. And I kind of like this reoccurring thematic motif of humanity rebuilding after after natural disasters, sort of giving off that theme of you can always rebuild your life after something really bad has happened. I don't know, it's just something that I just now noticed and I really appreciate it, and it's hell of a lot better than the quote-unquote story we have now. Trust me, we'll get to that. But other than that, I really don't think there's that much else to talk about in this update, so let's move on to the November update, which, added fuck all. The best thing to come from this update was the new gun shop UI, which I really like how you access guns now. Instead of clicking a prompt to obtain your weapon, you now actually have a full menu that shows all of the weapons in the game, with the exception of the baton, but get fucking real. And yes, this does include weapons like the plasma pistol, the force field launcher, the flintlock, the sniper rifle, and the revolver, as those weapons are only accessible at certain spots on the map, so it's nice that you can actually obtain all of the weapons at the gun shop. But other than that, nothing really happened in November of 2020, so let's move on to the final update of this year, the winter update of 2020. First of all, let's talk about the best feature that came from this update. C4. Yes, a new explosive has been added to the game in the form of sticky bombs, and these are really cool. Essentially, they're just grenades that have a significantly weaker throw radius, but in return, you can choose when to detonate them, and they stick onto objects, which is really cool. They're very useful for stunning players on the opposing team and taking down aerial vehicles, and they're actually involved with the robbery that would be added in this update. That robbery being the bank truck. Now, the bank truck is fucking shit, but I will respect it for actually involving both teams properly. Essentially, how it worked is that two cops need to be inside of the bank truck for it to be drivable to a certain location. Once you get to one of these locations, the back doors would open up and give the cops an opportunity to deliver the money to said location. And this is all while the criminals are trying to intercept the cops from delivering the money. As a criminal, you can either wait until the cops reach the designated drop-off point or intercept their route and blow open the back doors using C4. And you can rack up a maximum of $13,000 from the bank truck if you're robbing it alone. And get this, you can get the same amount of money from the bank truck as a police officer when you're delivering the money. Oh my god, I cannot believe my eyes when I say they finally made a robbery where it is actually worth being involved as a police officer. This is the first robbery in I don't know how long where the game actually feels like a game of cops and robbers. Like, when a truck-centric robbery was first being teased, I honestly thought that it was just gonna kind of be a duplicate of the cargo train, except it would move along the road rather than on tracks. But this is an honest attempt at making a tried and true cops and robbers robbery. Which is unfortunate because the execution sucks. This is one of the worst robberies in the game. In pure concept, this is perfect. This is what Jailbreak should be. Except when you actually rob it, you realize there are several factors about how the game is designed that contradict this robbery entirely. First of all, combat just sucks between cops and criminals. Like, when you're trying to take out the cops that are delivering the money from the bank truck, it is nearly impossible to actually get a heavy hit on them with most weapons because they can just use the force field launcher, which essentially just invalidates all of the bullets you're sending their way. But you can also use the plasma pistol, but you have to be in a really close range to actually get a heavy hit on them with that. And as a criminal, you do not want to be in a close proximity to any kind of police officer because they can just tase you and arrest you, or to straight up arrest you. So the only real effective way of dealing with police officers is using the rocket launcher or any other type of explosive. But honestly, I am not a huge fan of having to buy individual explosives to actually take care of a robbery, because that means you're just getting less money from the robbery because you're just using the money to rob the thing. It's backwards. It's backwards design. And you know what I said earlier in this video about how the hotbar is just really unintuitive? Yeah, the combat in this game, especially now, really just saturates that fact. Because to be completely prepared for this robbery, you're gonna need a plasma pistol, a rocket launcher, and grenades, on top of the weapons you most likely already have. And it just creates a really disorganized inventory system, and it's just bad. It's just bad. And the fact that people that are in the bank truck collecting their money can just easily protect themselves from bullets using the force field launcher kind of goes to show that maybe that thing should have never been implemented anyway. Perhaps if overall gameplay combat was just thought differently and was just better overall, I feel like the bank truck would just be better for that. And maybe the cop team should also be rethought a little bit, because it is just so piss easy to arrest criminals in the bank truck. So, yeah, not good. Though I did talk about how I would rethink cop gameplay briefly in my video on camping if you're interested in that. It really sucks because the way the bank truck is designed and thought out is really good. But it's just unfortunate that it just does not fit in this kind of game. And I know Asimo has said before that he wants to potentially revamp the bank truck, but honestly, I'd much rather see a revamp of every other robbery with this kind of philosophy of having both teams involved. Rather than revamping the bank truck to have it fit more with current Jailbreak, have current Jailbreak be revamped to fit more with the bank truck. I feel like that would be much better. And while you're at it, you might as well just also revamp cop versus criminal combat. Thank you very much. Also, I did forget to mention that because the bank truck does require a driver to drive you to the location where you drop off your money, your driver can more often than not be very unreliable. It's really something that they should have thought about beforehand, but yeah. And I suppose that's enough about the bank truck. Next up, we're going to be talking about the revamp of seasons, which I'll talk about in the next video. I'll see you then.